Hi, I'm Jerry Bowyer. Welcome to Meeting of Minds podcast. Today, my guest is Tom Carter. Tom is the president of the American Conservative Values Fund. It's an ETF. An ETF is one of the ways that people invest. If you've heard of mutual funds, well, most new investment vehicles are ETFs now rather than mutual funds, but very similar concept. And their firm has been doing surveys of their network of people who are interested in finance, often investors, about how they would rank companies and which companies they're most concerned with in terms of the left-wing ideological capture of those companies. Well, first of all, Tom, welcome to Meeting of Minds.
Jerry, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So tell me what trend you've seen. You've done 4 or 5 of these surveys, and they're not static. You're seeing some delta. You know, companies are rising and falling. What are the trends that you've seen?
That's right, Jerry. So we've done about 5 of these surveys now, and to your point, they're of a constituency that are some shareholders, some people just follow our research that like to hear what we're thinking about on the conservative investing side, and so we go out and ask them to rank their 3 most left-leaning or companies that are hostile to conservative values, and we've done 4 or 5 of these now. And what we saw in the first, I believe, 4 that we did was Facebook, or, they changed their name to Meta. Excuse me, they've been number 1 all along. What we found in the last one we did is that Disney surpassed Meta, which we thought was very interesting. Disney's always been on the list. They've always kind of been, kind of 4 or 5 or something along those lines. But this time they leaped in front of Meta, and they became the number 1 most disliked company for conservative investors, or for at least our constituency of conservative investors. That's certainly one trend we've seen. We also saw a trend where BlackRock has gone from kind of being in the mid-teens to basically number 4 now. So all this news about BlackRock, a lot of news about ESG, and somewhat of the greenwashing that they're trying to make companies do from an ESG perspective, conservative investors have picked up on that. I don't think they like the fact that BlackRock is trying to force people to follow what their ideology is. And I believe that they've come back and said, we don't really like that. And we think BlackRock is hostile to conservative values like Disney is. Meta, by the way, is still disliked very much, just not as much as Disney is in our most recent survey.
Interesting. Also, I think you told me you had some shifts in the world of Twitter. What's happened there?
We did. So obviously, most conservatives know that Twitter has been negative to conservatives. They blocked certain stories when the New York Post was trying to do things about Hunter Biden's laptop and whatnot. And during that time frame, Twitter was very, very negative. We did see that since Elon Musk has been more involved with Twitter, trying to get them to open up a little bit more, trying to make sure that he thinks it's an actual free speech as opposed to free speech only for the left, and the rights voices getting squelched to some extent. Twitter has actually become more popular among conservatives, or less unpopular.
When was this survey taken? When did you close the results for the survey?
I believe we closed the results, and my partner runs the survey a lot more closely than I do, but I believe it was at the end of May of this year, and then it took us a while to compile.
I see.
You can see the survey results out on our website, and you can see what conservatives think, and we also have some trend lines there where it shows past surveys, and it shows the change in companies from survey to survey.
That's conservativeinvesting.com. Is that the website?
Investconservative.com.
Investconservative.com.
ACVETFS.com.
I think investconservative.com will probably be easier to remember.
I agree with that.
It would be interesting the Twitter deal blew up, after this spring. So
that's right.
When people asked me at the time, I said Elon Musk is probably not going to buy Twitter. The market price never was consistent with that scenario. What's going to end up happening is even better. He'll destroy its credibility. He'll have a war with Twitter, and Twitter will have no credibility left. I don't think Twitter was ever fixable. So if it's not fixable, then destroy it.
Well, and that's what it looks like he's trying to do, right? I mean, I think he's trying to show that their actual subscriber base is a lot lower than you think it is. There's a lot more bots. I think he's trying to show that in fact they were squelching conservative values voices and allowing the left to run Twitter, if you will. And I think that's coming to air now. And I tend to agree with you. If he fully pulls back and Twitter is not fixed, it will become negative again. I predict that.
Yeah, yeah. But what about Tesla? Has that shown up? Because it was a liberal darling for a long time. I sat in on the last shareholder meeting, and it's amazing how conservative. I don't even know if they're conservative, actually, now that I think about it. The Tesla liberals, however, have become very hostile to kind of the ultra left ESG. I mean, all these people were showing up and giving their statements on behalf of these proposals, and when the moderator would say, "Okay, sorry, your time has elapsed," the crowd would cheer. This is Tesla, electric cars, solar panels. So this is probably a liberal crowd, but even they seem to have had enough. So how's Tesla? Tesla's, I think, probably pretty conservative, pretty popular with conservatives now. What's the history on Tesla in your survey?
Well, what's interesting is when we launched our product, Tesla wasn't even in the S&P 500, right? And so when they put Tesla in the S&P 500, we of course put them in as well in order to try to compete with try to match as closely as we could with the S&P 500. And we had a debate about Tesla at the time. We knew Elon Musk was somewhat of a libertarian. He wanted the government to leave him alone. He hated the COVID shutdowns and actually left California because of that and moved headquarters to Texas. So there's certainly some conservative values that we see within Tesla. And let's be clear, we're not against green energy. We're not against things that make the world better. We are just against mandates or trying to force green energy on people, or the government subsidizing green energy when maybe the economics of it don't make sense. So we're not against Tesla, and in fact, Tesla is a holding in our product, and Tesla actually doesn't show up as hostile to conservative values very much in our surveys.
I wouldn't expect.
So I think you're right. I think Tesla, although it is a green company, is somewhat conservative from the standpoint of where conservatives see it.
Well, I think there's an alliance now between conservatives and liberals against the hard left, against the utopian left. And I think Musk is an example of that. I mean, Musk is probably a liberal by most reasonable standards. That's what he would say. He'd say he's a liberal.
He said he always voted liberal.
Yeah, right. And because he believes in compassion and tolerance. He said, but the left doesn't believe in compassion and tolerance anymore. So he's still liberal, but he's not what they are. And they're showing up at the annual meeting, and Tesla shareholders are booing them off the stage. So that's really fascinating. That shows me how much ESG has overstayed its welcome and overpromised and frankly gotten obnoxious to the point where now it's alienating its allies.
I agree with that. And one last comment about Elon Musk. He tweeted something about 3 months ago when the left was after him about his new kind of viewpoints. And what he said was, these aren't new viewpoints. These are the same viewpoints I've already had. I've not moved. You have. And then he showed a diagram of where he thinks the left is now versus where he is. And he's like, I'm now a centrist or right-leaning compared to where you guys moved, but I haven't moved. I'm the same. So to your point, he still considers himself a compassionate, I would call him an old-time Kennedy compassionate liberal.
Yeah.
But he is certainly not a left-leaning hard left-leaning liberal like what he feels is coming out against him.
Well, isn't that basically what Reagan said? I didn't leave the Democratic Party. Why'd you leave the Democratic Party? Reagan said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me.
That's right.
Yeah. Interesting. So let's talk about ESG. There's been somewhat of a debate ongoing where some Christian funds and maybe even some of the conservative funds have kind of said, well, we're ESG. There's a good kind of ESG. And, we're not the bad kind of ESG. I think from my standpoint, ESG was sort of designed for what it is from the very beginning. It was always an imposition of politics onto finance. But We haven't actually talked about this, so I don't know what you think about it. But same thing I asked Andy Olivastro from Heritage recently, which is ESG, fix it or end it, and he said destroy it, right? Bury it in the ground. So what says Tom Carter? ESG, is it like a fixable thing, or is ESG is associated with the left, always will be, and we're not going to try to take the words ESG back and fix them and rebrand them?
Well, it's interesting. If I can give you a bit of history about how ACVF came to be. It essentially was because of ESG, right? So my partner and I, 4 years ago, were noticing that ESG, which was mostly driven by green energy, anti-fossil fuel, left-leaning corporate governance, and things like that, was drawing a lot of dollars. And we looked around and said, what can a politically conservative investor do? Where can their money go? Is there something they can support that isn't ESG, or that is, not giving, and you and I can debate this, not giving your investment capital to a left-leaning company? Right. And so that's how ACVF was brought about. From an ESG perspective itself, I think environmental, social governance things are good to look at, and but they can be looked at in a myriad of different ways. And if you're just saying that it's anti-fossil fuel and that's all you're looking at as ESG being, I think you're missing a lot of what ESG can be. And so to define it, I think you need to define it from a product perspective of what you're trying to achieve, not just saying we're broadly ESG, because defining broad ESG is very difficult because it can mean so many things. But the only thing that we look at it now to mean is left-leaning corporate policies.
Right. And is that brand now welded? In other words, I've heard some people say, well, we're conservative ESG or we're Christian ESG. Would you call yourself ESG?
We would not. No. Although
why not? That's the question.
Well, I'll tell you the primary reason is because when the government and the SEC come looking at what you're doing and you call yourself ESG, you've got to prove to them that you are. Yep. And you've got to prove that the reasons that you invest in certain companies or don't invest in others go along with your ESG guidelines.
Yes.
And we're probably a bit more subjective about the way we select companies in our portfolio, or more importantly, the way we select companies to boycott in our portfolio. And so defining us as ESG is very difficult, even though I would tell you that environmental, social, and governance aspects are implied in what we're doing. We do not call ourselves ESG.
Yeah, I guess to me, that's a great point, right? You're inviting litigation, you're inviting regulation,
That's right.
By doing that. Better to not do than to swear and do. What is Solomon says, I'm not getting the quote quite right. I have COVID brain today, but better to do and swear not than to swear and do not. So
that's right.
There's a promissory element to ESG. But I guess the other thing is, in my opinion, it's a blown brand, especially for conservatives.
I think you're right. And I would tell you that's probably another reason we don't call ourselves ESG, is because if we did, people would assume that we are a left-leaning anti-fossil fuels fund, not a right-leaning pro-fossil fuels, anti-left-leaning company fund, and which is what we are.
Yeah, I just got an email from someone who's in the industry on the Christian screening side, who for years I've been at conferences, and he said, well, no, there's a good kind of ESG, and we're the Christian ESG. And the email was, we renounce ESG. So it's like, okay, he's catching up. Basically, conservatives, Christians, they now see ESG as a negative thing. And
agreed.
And I think they're right to, because I think from the beginning, it's a little bit like stakeholder capitalism, right? Why come up with a doctrine if you already believed in shareholder capitalism? What's the point of a new thing, right? So to say, well, we're stakeholder capitalism, which is really capitalism, what capitalism always was. It's no. You had to come up with a new phrase and new books and new rules because you didn't like the traditional shareholder-focused capitalism. So and ESG is essentially the application of that to the investing process. So
that's right.
It was intended to counter the thing that actually made this nation prosperous.
No, I totally agree with that. And when you talk about stakeholder capitalism, are the people that are complaining actually stakeholders? Often it's debatable whether they are stakeholders or not, right? I mean, I would tell you the stakeholders are employees, the stakeholders are consumers that are purchasing your service or your product, the stakeholders are your shareholders. Oftentimes, the people on the left that are complaining about things, policies of companies and whatnot, I would argue aren't even stakeholders. I
They
mean,
yes, they speak on behalf of stakeholders that maybe aren't even, so they're out there saying, well, indigenous people are stakeholders. Are you an indigenous person? Well, no, 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 I'm not.
that's right.
But you drilled on their land and they're stakeholders. It's like, well, maybe we can just talk to them. Why do you have to get in the middle of this thing?
Agreed.
Yeah, they represent stakeholders who
Yeah,
they don't actually
and when you look
represent.
in right, and when you look into the boardrooms, right? I mean, are they making these decisions because they actually feel this way, or are they making decisions so that they don't get canceled by the left and by the people who are representing those stakeholders?
Right.
If they're let's take Netflix for example, right? And Netflix is a company that shows up in our top 10 of companies that are hostile to conservative values. They always do. Now, but we've also seen a bit of a change there because Netflix now has some conservative programming on their platform, and a bunch of what we call their stakeholders, which are employees, came to them and said, "Hey, look, we're not going to support this conservative." This conservative entertainment on our platform, and Netflix came back to them and say, we're gonna subscribe to all entertainment that we think is quality entertainment, whether it's left leaning or right leaning, and if you don't like it, we think you should work somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so what Netflix kind of did was they took back their stakeholder capitalism and they said, we're going to make decisions that are best for our shareholders and for what we think is our company, and although you guys are employees, we ask that you don't get involved in some of these decisions. And so when they did that, conservatives are actually kind of opened their eyes and said, "Oh, hey, this Netflix thing, maybe we need to watch these guys a little bit more because maybe they're coming a bit more conservative than we thought they were."
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. It's one thing to be the canceller, and it's another thing to be the cancelee. So Reed Hastings was on the board of, Meta, formerly Facebook, and when Peter Thiel endorsed Donald Trump, Hastings tried to get Thiel canceled, tried to get him kicked off the board of Facebook, a company he basically founded, right? And
Right.
that didn't work. Thiel had more juice in that situation. But Hastings was willing to cancel. But when his employees start interfering with his profit margin by trying to cancel Dave Chappelle, who is just bringing in buku revenues, right? And now Ricky Gervais and Bill Burr.
Yes,
So
plenty. There's a myriad of examples.
yeah, and another point to make about this: they're liberals, yeah, right? They
Absolutely.
so they're again. It's the fight is now mostly the hard left. It's just like 1968 over again. Like it's the hard left outside the Democratic National Convention throwing firebombs, while the Democrats are actually trying to nominate someone who maybe could potentially win in a general election. And so, Dave Chappelle's no conservative. Bill Burr,
No.
maybe, probably not. Ricky Gervais is an aggressive atheist. I think he's a socialist. Doesn't live like one, but he talks like one. But they think that, this cancel culture and especially the trans element of it and its violent threats and the rest of it has gotten out of hand. They're simply free speech people.
That's
And
right.
and that's interfering with Reed Hastings' business model, and all of a sudden he's maybe a little bit. We shouldn't be canceling anymore because they were canceling. They're trying to cancel shows that were making money.
And they were trying to, and a very few people were trying to cancel shows that a lot of people liked, right? And and I am like you were just saying, I'm a free speech person. I'm also a fan of comedy, and I'm a fan of comedy on either side because I think good comedy brings out the realism in everything that you do, and so good, clean, fun comedy I enjoy, and I don't think we should cancel those folks because they are bringing up things that are often important to people in the culture.
Yeah, and I would say, interestingly enough, comedy is probably the vanguard of the counter revolution now against cancel culture.
That's right.
Right? The Gervaises and the Burrs and almost every comedian. I watch a lot of comedy too. They can't help it. the thing that you've told them not to say, now they have to do it. They have to talk about these issues. The very fact that they've been told to shut up about it makes it irresistible to them.
That's right.
And I just love to watch them do it. And I mean, who's not going to take the stuffing out of these self-important people? This crowd of tolerance people who are trying to ruin everybody's lives. I mean, it's just ripe for comedy takedown.
It is. And like you said, I don't agree with everything they say, but I enjoy watching it.
Yeah, sure, of course not. I mean, Gervais is an atheist. I mean, what did Chappelle say? He said, "I don't hate trans people. I hate white people."
Exactly.
Well, okay, I don't like him hating white people. I don't even know if he does hate white people, but he was making a rhetorical point, which is
right.
a white man who never could have lorded it over me in the present, me being Dave Chappelle, lorded over Dave Chappelle in the present context. All he has to do is pop on a wig and change his name and his pronouns, and now he's the victim. And Dave Chappelle has to kiss his toe. And it's like, sorry, I'm not falling for that. Even long ago, I shouldn't get off on all this, but Chappelle started talking about this like 4 years ago, and he said LGBTQ, and he says LGB, they're kind of looking at T and saying, do you belong in the car? Are we on the same ride here as the rest of you? And I think that was his early recognition that particular constituency was moving into a authoritarian mode. And by the way, that's what the Disney thing was about. I mean, they say don't say gay, but really it was about what really triggered parents is, wait, what? You're going to talk about sexual reassignment surgery to my 5-year-old? I voted Democrat my whole life. No way. I think that was really the trigger for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think not only that, but then also everything with what was going on in schools and how they were trying to hide from parents what was being taught, what the curriculum was.
Yes.
And parents started going to school board meetings and telling and the school board saying you don't have a right to talk to about our curriculum. And that's why Youngkin, right? I think that's what turned in Virginia to get a Republican governor in a state that was 60% Democrat, I believe, if my numbers are correct. So I think you're right. I think everything that was happening in the schools, trans, critical race, and a number of other things that people felt uncomfortable with are pushing some of the people in the middle to kind of that conservative line of thinking. And I think, again, to your point earlier when we were talking about Disney, I believe that's pushing some investors, whether they're conservative or let's even say it's middle left. I think they're pushing away from Disney because of things like that.
Yes. And I think that crowd severely underestimated the deep emotional heart bond between parents and children.
Agreed.
That liberal parents, they were willing to vote a certain way and talk a certain way, but they were not willing to sacrifice their children on the altar of these ideologies.
I couldn't agree more. I
right.
think you're absolutely right.
So they'll even give money to Black Lives Matter, but if you're going to tell my 5-year-old that because he's white, he will never understand, and he's guilty, I don't care how liberal a parent. I mean, you have to be completely left-wing loony if you're going to say, oh, that's fine, that you can do that, or that being male is toxic. Well, these liberal suburban moms, they have little boys. And they love their little boys more than they love the accolades of being called an ally. And I think they underestimated the reality of that.
I think that's right. I agree with that.
Yeah. By the way, on the Disney point, I was there for the annual Disney meeting, logged in. And it was fascinating how much it was the left-wing activists who showed up, not the conservatives. So what a case for engagement. Because originally, Bob Chapek wanted to be neutral on this. They started out neutral. They were pushed into attacking this bill by internal resource group and by politically active activists. So whether you own it or not, you don't, that's fine. I've got clients who do. If you do own it, show up. If you do own it, vote. Don't gripe back. Because I was amazed afterwards, like that night on Tucker, Disney's horrible, and 1 million people are watching, and I'm like, if 10 of you million could have been there with us at that annual meeting asking questions, there would have been a different answer.
No, I agree. And a story about our fund and our investing and a couple of holdings that were actually in our portfolio. And this was January of 2021, right when the Georgia election laws came out.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked at the Georgia election laws, and of course we read them before we came out against them.
Wait, what?
We're actually for them. We didn't come out against them. We're for them, but we read them before we came out for them.
I see.
And a lot of people came out against them because they were pushed to come out against them. And so both Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines were in our portfolio. And when they came out against the Georgia elections and tried to go to the Georgia state legislature and try to tell them to change that law or there were going to be repercussions, we booted them out of our portfolio. We said, look, we don't need those companies in our portfolio. They are against voter ID laws, and they're against a number of other things. Funny thing that happened, I'm actually based in Colorado. Funny thing that happened is they moved the All-Star game from Atlanta, right, which is probably a 50% black city, to Lily White Denver in order to protest Georgia. So essentially, and by the way, the Colorado voting laws versus the Georgia voting laws, there's not a lot of difference. But they cut their nose off despite their face over something that wasn't even that bad. And in fact, I think the Georgia voting laws are going to be laws that a lot of people look at to say these are actually fair and balanced, and that are going to protect our elections, but also allow people who want to vote to vote.
Well, I attended the Coca-Cola meeting, and my question for them is, you're against voter ID. What did I have to do in order to get into this meeting? You made me jump through a lot of hoops. I had to look up a special number. It was very difficult. It took research. So for me to vote at your annual meeting, is you secure it. It's important. Not anyone can vote in a Coca-Cola shareholder meeting. You have to prove that you're a Coca-Cola shareholder. But we're upset because, there was a law passed so that not anyone could walk into a polling place. I mean, all you do is make sugar water, Coca-Cola. These elections determine who controls nuclear weapons. So maybe they should have to prove as much as we shareholders have to prove.
That's right. I thought another interesting thing that just happened, and it happened in LA County, right? And they were trying to repeal Gascon. And they had something like 720,000 signatures. They needed something like 525,000, and the signatures weren't good enough, and so they didn't get enough names on the petition to get him on the ballot to recall. And I was like, okay, here's a bunch of people who don't want voter ID and they don't want signatures, but yet when signatures work for them, they're going to use these signatures in order to not get this repeal election happening.
Right. They're going to comb through the signatures to make sure they knock out. You can't have one invalid signature, right, for the recall. When the fact is, the reality is, I remember talking about this in the 2000 recount. Every false vote counted is a true vote canceled.
That's right.
So allowing people to vote who aren't registered is voter suppression. It's just voter suppression by subtraction rather than blocking originally. So I add my vote, then you take it away. Don't tell me I might as well have stayed home rather than gone down there to get the little sticker. So look, you were ahead of this. Your fund is almost 2 years old. Probably took about 2 years planning to get it up and running. So 4 years ago, you saw something coming when conservatives were frankly blissfully ignorant for the most part. Kind of MIA on this issue, just thinking voting is the only thing I need to be concerned about. And American corporations are reliable allies for now and all eternity. What did you see coming that made you start something that kind of fits what's needed now?
So I think it was a number of things. I think one thing we've already talked about was ESG, and we saw the surge in ESG products that were mostly anti-fossil fuel, green energy, much more left-leaning, and we saw a flow of money into those funds, and we looked to say, what do politically conservative people have to invest in that might match their values? And we really couldn't find anything. There were certainly some good faith-based or biblical funds out there, which we agreed with, but they might have been a little bit more narrow than we were going to be. And so, just for a pure conservative, we weren't finding things. And then we started seeing things, like when um, Google was hiding searches about Hillary Clinton during the 16 election, and they were, you could put in Trump, and the first 5 articles were negative, right? So things like that. We saw companies starting to conceal things about the left and block voices on the right. And we said, look, these are companies doing this, and they're going against conservative values. And then, of course, conservatives dislike the liberal media, right? And we were looking at Disney owning ABC and ESPN, Comcast owning NBC and MSNBC, AT&T owning CNN. The New York Times was in the S&P 500. And we said conservatives who buy an S&P 500 fund are investing in companies that they disagree with and dislike.
Right.
We need to give them a product that allows them to invest their money, get similar returns to the S&P 500, while not giving their hard-earned investment dollars to companies that they don't agree with. And that's what led us to the way we constructed and built this fund, which is a fund which does our best to meet or exceed the performance of the S&P 500 while eliminating companies hostile to conservative values.
So the pollstar is returns, not politics.
I'm sorry?
The Polestar, the Polaris.
Absolutely. It has to be returns. I've been in the ETF and mutual fund industry long enough to know that affinity funds that don't return lose affinity. And if you're going to gain people and you want their affinity, you have to give returns that are in line with the broader indexes. And if you can do that and keep your affinity to those folks, you will raise dollars. And if you don't, those dollars will go elsewhere. They will look for the return.
Wonderful. Tom Carter, it's been a delight speaking with you. Anything you want to say to our listeners and viewers before we go?
Jerry, I think this conservative investing, politically conservative investing, is kind of new, but I think it's going to grow. I think there are new entrants into the marketplace, and we ask, as you look at those entrants and as you evaluate your investments, that you take a look at us, and we think a rising tide lifts all boats, and so we're excited to be kind of one of the first to do this, and looking forward to talking to conservatives as we move forward.
We've been talking with Tom Carter, president of the American Conservative Values Fund, and you have been listening to Meeting of Minds podcast with Jerry Bowyer. Thanks for joining us.